Hello, this is Mr. Marriott with Noteworthy Science. Today we're going to be doing topic A1.1 Water. In the curriculum matrix, this falls under theme A, Unity and Diversity, and under the level of organization of 1, Molecules. Some guiding questions to keep in the back of your mind when you're learning this topic is 1, what physical and chemical properties really make water essential for life? And 2, what are the challenges and opportunities that water provides in terms of habitats, in terms of animals actually being able to use it, both to live in and on and etc. So this whole topic is really all about why is water and life really, why do they go hand in hand? Why is it so important? In standard level, there are 6 learning outcomes that we're going to be discussing today. Let's begin. So before I begin anything here, I think it's a good idea to do a little bit of a chemistry review. So very basic chemistry review here. So in this case, we know, hopefully, that an atom is composed of 3 subatomic particles, right? So we have protons and neutrons in the nucleus, and we have electrons in the valence and in the outer shells of electrons. Now, where we care about a lot in bio, really, and chemistry is the valence shell, or the outer shell of electrons, because this effectively tells you how that atom is going to react. This outer shell of electrons is what we care about a lot. The nucleus is really going to determine the mass of that atom. Because while electrons do have a mass, they're incredibly small compared to a single proton relative mass. So that's why we don't take them into account. So we're not really going to be using a periodic table in biology, but this is just a little bit of a review just in case you needed a little refresher as to what we're talking about here. Key things to understand is that the atomic number, or this number at the top here, is unique to that element. That means if you have an unknown atom with 6 protons, it is always carbon, forever. If you change the proton number, you are fundamentally changing the atom. This mass has to do with both protons and neutrons, and if you're wondering how we can have a decimal, how can I have 0.01 of a neutron, how does that work? Well, you don't, it's an average, and it's an average of isotopes, something that we'll talk about later in biology. So this is just a little bit of a review. Now, the parts that I think are going to be really important for us to understand the properties of water are going to be this property, something called electronegativity. So this is actually going to help explain, hopefully, a lot about what makes water so unique. So electronegativity really is a fancy way of saying how much does the atom's nucleus hold on to electrons. The more electronegative, the more it's going to attract those electrons. The less electronegative, the less it's going to hold on to those electrons. A way of thinking about this, which is not technically the same, but I think it's an easy way for us to conceptualize it, is consider a really big magnet and a really small magnet, right? This is not magnetism, but it hopefully will help you understand this a little bit. How much of a pull does this thing have? So there's 2 major factors that will influence the electronegativity of an atom. The first one is just how many protons does it have in its nucleus? The more protons it has, generally speaking, the more of a pull it's going to have, right? Again, a very simple analogy would be like a really small magnet, bigger magnet, big magnet, right? I mean, again, this is not magnet, but to help you conceptualize. More protons, more pull, right? That makes sense. But if you actually take a look at the electronegativity throughout the periodic table, then this would imply that the most electronegative atoms are the ones at the very bottom, the huge atoms. But that's not true. So why is that? Well, there's a second factor, and that has to do with how close is the valence shell to the nucleus. The further that shell becomes, the more other electrons are in the way. So to use an example here, we have lithium, sodium, and potassium. Now, lithium is actually the smallest atom compared to potassium, yet it has a greater electronegativity than potassium. Isn't this counterintuitive to what I just said here? Well, it's because this valence shell is way closer to the nucleus than this valence shell. So again, to use an analogy like a magnet, it would be like I have a piece of metal in a magnet that's really close, and I'm moving it further and further and further away. The further away I'm moving it, the less of a pull there is. So actually, both of these factors are important. How close that valence shell is to the nucleus, and how many protons there are. Why does this matter? Why am I talking about electronegativity? You guys are like, bro, I thought we were in a bio class. What's going on here? Well, it will make sense, I promise. Because what electronegativity does is it's actually quite useful, because it actually tells you how two different atoms are going to react. If I have a really large, let's say I have atom A and I have atom B. And atom A has a really high electronegativity. And atom B has a really low electronegativity. When this kind of situation occurs, A is basically going to snipe the electrons from B. And that's where you get ions. So what kind of ion are you going to get here? An anion, and this will become a cation. And this is going to form an ionic bond. And that's really what an ionic bond is when you have two different atoms of really different electronegativities causing them to become ionic, and the attraction between these two is what an ionic bond is. So that electrostatic attraction between them. Now, if, let's say, I have A and A, what if I have two of the exact same atom? Well, their electronegativities are equal. So one isn't going to pull the electron from the other. So instead, what you get is you get a sharing. And that's where we get a covalent bond. Now, it's not only when they're two of the same, like for instance, two hydrogen. Two hydrogen form H2, right? They're going to share those electrons together. It's also if their electronegativities are different, but really tiny different. So any of these situations, you're going to form a covalent bond. And in this case, if the sharing is equal, we call this a non-polar covalent bond. Now, what if you have, again, A and B? A has a larger electronegativity than B, but it's not so much that it's going to pull it. They're still going to share. But in this case, the sharing is really unequal. An analogy here is if anyone's had an older sibling and a parent's asking to share something between the two siblings, it ain't going to be an equal sharing. The older sibling is almost certainly going to be using that thing a lot more than the younger sibling, even though technically you're sharing it, but one's getting it way more than the other. And that's kind of what a polar covalent bond is. You're still sharing electrons between two atoms, but the sharing is unequal. So what happens is you're going to start developing partial charges, and that's what we're going to be talking about with water. So let's get into what the whole point of today's lesson is, and that is water. So water is made up of hydrogen and oxygen, right? And just as a quick chemistry review, if you didn't know what the formula for water was, right, you can always figure it out using oxidation states, right? So you can take hydrogen and you can take oxygen, and you can say, okay, how many electrons does this atom need to get a full valence shell? Does it have to get rid of electrons, or does it have to take electrons? For hydrogen, it's 1. You can either take an electron or get rid of an electron. And for oxygen, it has 6 valence. Therefore, its oxidation state would be it needs 2 more. So it would be 2 minus. In this case, you can take these numbers, you can cross them, and that's how you get H2O. So that's telling you that for every water molecule, there will be 2 hydrogen atoms bonded to a single oxygen atom. What kind of bonding happens? Well, the bonding between hydrogen and oxygen is covalent. So this is not ionic. That means the oxygen atom Yes, oxygen does have a higher electronegativity than hydrogen, something we'll talk about in a second, but it's not so large that it's going to completely strip the electrons from hydrogen. So they're going to share a pair of electrons together. Another way of representing this, we're not going to have to draw this in biology. A much easier way of representing this is like this. So a straight line, unbroken, always in our course for biochemistry, will refer to a covalent bond, always. If I'm showing a straight line, this implies that there are 2 electrons being shared between them. If I'm doing 2 lines, then that means there's 4 electrons being shared between them, right? So that's what that line represents. It means they are sharing a pair of electrons between them. So really, all a covalent bond is the attraction between the positive nucleus and that pair of electrons. And that's why covalent bonds are actually very, very strong. They take a lot of energy to form, and they're actually quite difficult to break. You need a significant amount to break them. So they're quite stable. Now, as I mentioned, oxygen has a higher electronegativity than hydrogen. The main reason for this is that there is just way more protons than hydrogen. Hydrogen has 1, oxygen has 8. So as a result, oxygen has a far higher electronegativity than hydrogen does. So what does that mean? So, I mean, this is a little cartoon here. This is really what's going on here. They are sharing electrons, but they're spending significant amount of time more around oxygen than they are around hydrogen. What does this mean? This means that you're going to form polarity. So because the electrons are spending more time around oxygen, this causes the oxygen to be slightly negative. And because the electrons are spending less time around hydrogen, it's causing the hydrogen to be slightly positive. The way that we represent slightly is using a lowercase Greek delta. So you guys are probably familiar with capital delta in math, which is a triangle, right? Which usually refers to change in, right? In this case, we're using a lowercase delta, which represents slightly. So in this case, if I want to say slightly positive, I would draw it like this. And if I want to do slightly negative, I would do it like this. Okay, so that's all this is. It's like it's a lowercase d, really, but it's Greek, so it looks fancy. So in this case, that's what this means here. So this is actually a polar covalent bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen. Now, that's the reason for all of basically water's cool properties, because it is a polar molecule. When I say polar, what I mean here is I think people misrepresent the term polar. Probably they think polar, they think cold. But polar really just means the extremities of something, right? So consider Earth. We have a north pole and a south pole. So in this case, if you consider water, this would be the positive pole, this would be the negative pole. So in this case, you can call water a polar molecule, or you can even refer to water as having a dipole, 2 different charges. I'm going to show you step by step how to draw and label a water molecule, and if I asked you to draw, let's say, 3 water molecules interacting, what would that look like? So let's start off with hydrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, just like that. We're now going to do a straight line, and you're now going to represent, do not forget to represent the partial charges. So I'm going to put slightly positive, slightly positive, slightly negative. If now I'm saying, how would this water molecule interact with 2 other water molecules? Hydrogen, oxygen, hydrogen. let's do partial charges. The positively charged hydrogens are going to be attracted to their opposite charge, in this case, the slightly negative oxygens. That means the two oxygen poles will repel each other, and the two hydrogen poles will repel each other. So the way that we represent hydrogen bonds are with dotted or dashed lines. So you can either do a bunch of dots or you can do a bunch of dashes, but do not do a solid line. Remember, a solid line represents a covalent bond. So you can just do, if you want dots like this, or you can even do dashes. It doesn't really matter. Let's label, I can label this real quick. So I would use a ruler and I would just go that, and I'll label this kind of charge here. Okay. So we already said this is a polar covalent bond, and this is a hydrogen bond. There's two key differences between these types of interactions here. The first is the strength, and the second is the nature of these bonds. So firstly, a polar covalent bond is significantly stronger than a hydrogen bond. So these are far more stable than these. Hydrogen bonds are formed and broken constantly. They are always forming, breaking, forming, breaking, forming, breaking. The next is, where exactly are these bonds? This bond is within a single molecule. Can anyone tell me what we would call this type of interaction? Intramolecular. And a hydrogen bond is between two molecules, and that would be intermolecular. Again, you may not have to actually label that, but they may ask you differences between inter and intra, and these prefixes will be like a constant theme used in science, where once you start seeing patterns between prefixes and suffixes, you can start to try to guess the meaning of words. You can try to start to understand what's going on here. Now, this as a label would be fine. As a note in biology, any time that you're being asked to draw, it must be in pencil. That's really what this section was really about. It's asking that you understand effectively why are these water molecules actually interacting the way they do. This simulation right here is kind of nice, and it's basically telling you if I have water, let's say, as a liquid or as a gas or whatever. Now, if I'm increasing heat, can anyone tell me what they would expect to happen differently here? I'm increasing average kinetic energy, right? So if I'm increasing heat, I would expect them to just move around more. Now, it may be hard to see here, so let me cool it down a little bit and let me do slow motion. Notice these hydrogen bonds are constantly forming, breaking, forming, breaking, forming, breaking. You can even show here partial charges to try to help illustrate this. So you see it's kind of together, then it breaks, kind of together, and then it breaks, kind of together, then it breaks. The two oxygens are going to repel each other, as we've already discussed, and the two hydrogens will repel each other, as we've discussed. But I think this simulation is quite useful to demonstrate the fact that these hydrogen bonds, a term that you can use is that they're ephemeral, meaning that they're constantly forming, breaking, forming, breaking. You should not think of them as consistent, always staying kind of interactions. They're constantly forming, breaking. And the reason that hydrogen bonds are forming in the first place is because water is a dipole, or water is a polar molecule. The main key takeaways are, one, why is water forming polar covalent bonds, and why is it a polar molecule? And if the fact that you if you're going to remember one thing, remember that water is a polar molecule and it forms hydrogen bonds. That fact alone effectively explains all the properties we're about to discuss. Cohesion actually comes from the Latin, which I believe means to stick together. And so the idea here is co, in this case, is two of the same thing sticking together. In this case, water molecule A, water molecule B attracted to each other. That's when we talk about cohesion. So whenever discussing cohesion, it's water to water, not water to something else, water to water. So when water molecules attract each other, they're going to do so using hydrogen bonds, as we've already discussed. A single water molecule can form a maximum of 4 hydrogen bonds with 4 neighbors in a tetrahedral structure. Those of you doing chemistry will be looking into this shape more. This is the maximum amount of hydrogen bonds that a single water molecule can form. But again, keep in mind that this is not a stable structure. They will constantly be moving around. The only time where this is a stable structure is when it's a solid, and that is ice. So when water actually forms ice or solid, it has a very stable structure like this, and it actually tends to form these hexagons. Now, this is another thing that makes water like amazing, because it's virtually the only molecule that's less dense as a solid than it is as a liquid. Normally, if I'm going from a solid to a liquid to a gas, the molecules are moving more, meaning they're more spaced out. But that is the opposite of what happens when water is a solid. When water is a solid, or ice, they're actually more spaced out than they are when they were a liquid. And as a result, ice is less dense than liquid water. Now that might be like, cool story, bro, that's why my ice floats. Great. This is a main reason why there's even life in a lot of places in the world. Because imagine if this was not true. This means that when ice freezes, it sinks. This would cause entire lakes to completely freeze bottom to top. This would cause oceans potentially to freeze. Life would be impossible in these scenarios. The fact that even in very, very, very cold temperatures, you can still have liquid water because it's below ice. Ice will stay at the top. So this is a really unique property that water shares, and it's really because of these stable tetrahedral structure from these intermolecular forces of hydrogen bonds here. Now, if cohesion is between water to water, right, then water to something else is called adhesion. This also comes from the Latin, and this means, I think it's stick to something, or to. So you probably know this word in English, like to adhere to something means to stick to something. So adhesion is water to something else that's not water, right? So consider what water would even be attracted to in the first place. It would have to be charged, at least in some capacity. So either water is going to be attracted to another polar substance, or it's going to be attracted to an ion, something that's fully charged. And in that way, water is going to be able to interact or adhere to either a charged or a polar substance. So you'll often see that both cohesion and adhesion work in tandem, where water is not only attracted to itself, but it's also attracted to another material. A good example of this is transpiration. So we're going to be going over this in much more detail probably in grade 12 when we do gas exchange and we do transport. But transpiration, as a preview really, is just the flow of water through a plant. And typically it refers to the movement from roots all the way to leaves and shoots. Now, that might be like, all right, cool, who cares? Well, that's kind of amazing because it's going against gravity. Gravity is actually pulling water down, so how is it that water can go against gravity? And how can it do so when a plant doesn't have a pump like we do? We have a heart that can do that. They don't have that. So what's allowing water to actually go against gravity from the soil up all the way to the top? How is it able to do this? Well, it's actually a combination of both cohesion and adhesion together. The driving force is actually the sun. Sun is causing water up here to evaporate, And as more and more water evaporates, it creates an area of low pressure. If you have low pressure here and high pressure here, water is driven from high pressure to low pressure. This is actually, believe it or not, how sucking water through a straw works. This is how suction works. If you're causing suction in your mouth, that's causing the air in your mouth to have low pressure, causing water here to have higher pressure, driving it from high pressure to low pressure. That's really all suction is. If I'm taking more things out, I'm dropping the pressure. So as long as the sun is causing water to evaporate, there's this driving force. Okay, so that's what the force is. But what's causing water to go up? How is it actually able to do this? And this is something called capillary action. So capillary action is named after the fact of capillaries, or capillaries, however you want to say it, very, very, very small tubes. If you have very, very, very small tubes, then actually you have both adhesion and cohesion at play. So let me show you a quick example here. Let's imagine I have a basin of water here, and I have 3 different tubes of various diameters. So let's say this tube has a very small diameter, and then larger, and then larger. Now take a look at this diagram and tell me why this tube was able to pull water higher than this tube. So in both cases, water is making hydrogen bonds with the tube, or let's say it's glass, right? So that's happening. Now consider the proportion of hydrogen bonds that are being formed here versus here relative to its mass. Here, the mass of water is only here, but it's able to make hydrogen bonds all around here. Versus here, you have all of this mass, but you actually don't have that much more surface area relative to its mass. Because there's so many more hydrogen bonds here, it's able to overcome and pull water despite gravity pulling it down. At some point, if I have a tube like this big, water isn't going to rise up anymore. And that's because the hydrogen bonds is not strong enough to overcome the mass of water anymore, so it's going to fall. So anytime that you see capillary action, it always occurs in very, very, very small tubes. So when we see this in plants, you don't just have a giant tube running up a trunk. We already know that's not going to happen. If you do a cross section of a plant, then actually what you see is a bunch of little tubes grouped together. And those tubes that carry water are called, something that we'll talk about in another topic, xylem. So if you take a look at this cross section now of xylem, then you have water being driven up. How does this work? Well, you have water forming, I did solid lines here, my bad, but these are all hydrogen bonds, okay? But they're forming hydrogen bonds with themselves, that's cohesion, but they're also forming attractions with the walls, adhesion. So the walls of these xylem are polar, and as a result, they're able to interact with these water molecules. So water is not only attracted to itself, they're also attracted to the sides. And because there's this pulling nature of the sun causing water to evaporate, it's almost like if all of us were in a line holding hands and I start running in one direction. I'm going to pull on my neighbor, 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 and you get this one big chain that's actually able to pull water up. So these properties here are really due to adhesion and cohesion working together. This is also what allows water to move through soil. It's weird to think about, but if you consider soil as a substance, soil is not just a solid one big mass. It's actually made up of a bunch of smaller particles. And each of those particles has water associated with them. And this allows water to trickle through soil. It's almost like if you're making coffee and you have a bunch of coffee grounds. Water is able to circulate through these little particles here, and it's allowing it to move through this. So this is how we can get water moving across soil into roots, up xylem and out through leaves, is through these processes of adhesion and cohesion. The last process I want to talk about here, or sorry, the last property I should say, is that of surface tension. And that is, if you ever look at the surface of water, it appears like the top of the water is stronger than the inside part of the water. If you have a glass of water like this, right, and if you were to do a cross section, so let's say I'm looking directly straight in line with the water, you see water is actually able to do this. And it bulges around. All that's happening here is surface tension, right? So what surface tension really is, it's when water can form bonds below it, but not above it. And let's say this water droplet is obviously composed of a lot of different water molecules. Here, notice that that water molecule is able to interact with water all around it. So that means that the forces of those hydrogen bonds are spread out over a lot of different water molecules. So they're relatively really, really weak. But if you consider a water molecule up here, it can't form bonds above it, only below it. So what surface tension does is it almost forces inside. This is why water forms droplets. It's pulling on the inside, but it has nothing to pull from the top. This means that if you were to look at the relative strength of these bonds versus the relative strength of these bonds, these are going to be stronger than these. So when you now look at, let's say, a lake, the water down here can form bonds all around it, but the water up here cannot. It can only form bonds adjacent to it and below, but not here. So it means that the surface of water has a film-like quality, where it's much stronger at the surface than it is at the bottom. So that property is what surface tension is. There's a lot of different animals that are like, bet I'm going to take advantage of that. And one of them is a water strider. You've seen these in ponds in Japan all the time. They're all over the place. You see these little insects and, like, and they run all the way across the water. It may seem like they're floating, but they're not really floating because they're not actually breaking the surface of the water. Right? Floating is when I can still be submerged in water and still remain at the top. They're not even cracking the surface of it. How can they do that? Well, a few ways. One, they're incredibly lightweight, so they have very little gravitational force pulling down. But secondly, they actually have these little hairs on their legs that are hydrophobic or resist water, so they repel water a little bit. That's another adaptation. But this surface tension here is actually stronger than the gravitational force pulling it down. So they're taking advantage of this surface tension and allowing them to actually move across the surface of a liquid. There's even spiders that can do this. If you look up raft spiders, they're also able to do this as well, where they can actually be at the top of a pond or whatever without actually falling through. So surface tension enables these animals to actually kind of have a different habitat, kind of have a different niche. It's allowing them not to have to, they may not even be able to swim. They don't need to. They're at the top here. So that's a completely new habitat for them to inhabit. Another example here is even the life cycle of mosquitoes. Females will lay eggs on the very surface of ponds. And they're able to still get oxygen and CO2 exchange happening here. And then because of surface tension, they're able to reside at the very top here. So it means that they can avoid predators that normally maybe would eat them inside of it. And then, as these grow into larvae and then pupa, the cycle can then continue. So they're also taking advantage of surface tension at the top here. So surface tension really gives another kind of habitat that some animals can exploit. So because water is polar, or it has dipolarity, a slightly positive side and a slightly negative side, it is also an extremely good solvent. Sometimes water is referred to as the universal solvent, but that's not technically correct. Universal means it can dissolve everything. That's not true. Water cannot dissolve everything. And anyone here who's tried to wash things out tries to wash out pots and pans with oil will tell you that it is extremely difficult to wash out because oil and some other things that we'll talk about today do not dissolve in water. So dissolving is not a chemical reaction. There's an exchange of electrons going on here. There's no new substances being formed here. What dissolving is really an interaction. And specifically, it's the interaction of a solute with a solvent. So the solute is the substance being dissolved. The solvent is a liquid in which that solute is dissolving into. For our purposes, that solvent is going to be water. If you are placing a solute within a solvent, and you give enough time and you mix it and whatever, and you don't really see any difference, then that's effectively a homogeneous solution. You can't see the parts anymore. It has fully dissolved. If, however, you try to dissolve two things together and the parts just remain separate, then that would be a heterogeneous or heterogeneous solution, in which case it's non-uniform, and that means the solute and the solvent are not interacting with each other. So why is water such an incredible solvent? Well, if we know what it means to dissolve, it means that a solute and a solvent are interacting with each other. Well, water is a polar molecule. What solutes will it dissolve? So anything that also has a charge, either slight charge, like in polarity, or a full charge, as in ions, water is going to be an excellent solvent for these types of solutes. So let's look at that. When we discuss properties of substances relative to water, then we're going to use these terms a lot. And we're going to talk about something called hydrophilicity or hydrophobicity. So hydro means water as a prefix. So if you ever see hydro, that's what we're talking about. And phobia, you've likely heard of before, that literally means fear of. Like arachnophobia is the fear of spiders or arachnids, right? So hydrophobic literally means the fear of water. Now, obviously, that's a personification here because there's no molecules that are literally afraid of water, but it means that there are any molecules that will not interact with water. So these molecules would be nonpolar or uncharged. And great examples of that are lipids. Now, as we've just discussed, molecules that will dissolve in water would be those that are attracted to water. So that would be hydrophilic or water-loving. So any molecules that are hydrophilic, these are molecules that are either partially charged, as in they're polar, or they're fully charged, and they will absolutely interact with water, and these will be able to dissolve within water. So let's take a look at some examples here. The first example is ionic compounds. Ionic compounds dissolve in water readily. So why is that? What's actually going on when things dissolve in it? So if I take table salt, salt from a chemistry perspective, it's an ionic compound formed between any cation and an anion. That's it. So in everyday English or colloquial English, we use salt to mean table salt, i.e. sodium chloride, or sodium and chlorine together. So if you were to zoom in to a sodium chloride like cube or whatever, you're going to see this interaction. So you're going to see anions, chloride, and cations, sodium, and they have an electrostatic attraction between them, and that's what's holding them all together. Now if I take table salt and I now place it inside of water, what's really going on? It's not that this is now bonding to water, like a new bond is occurring, but there are going to be interactions. So when you place that within water, what ends up occurring is that the anions become more attractive to the slightly positive hydrogens of water, and the cations become more attracted to the slightly negative oxygens. So they actually dissociate. So salt is still there. So the idea is that as long as water is present, it will effectively separate these two things out. Now I have a question. If I pour in some salt, stir it around, it dissolves. Pour some in, stir it around, it dissolves. If I keep pouring salt in, eventually you're going to start to get some salt that builds up at the bottom. Why? You've ran out of water. Water is surrounding, it's something called a hydration shell. Obviously I'm only showing this in 2D, but they will surround them entirely. And at some point, you're going to keep adding in more sodium chloride, sodium chloride, sodium chloride. You're going to run out of water to actually form shells around. So you've hit saturation. So that thing is now fully saturated. You can't actually dissolve anything more in that thing. So this is, if you ever have any substance, not just salt, any substance dissolved in water is called an aqueous solution. And in fact, that should be a review from chemistry as well, because, for instance, acids that are dissolved within water, something like hydrogen chloride dissolved within water, we use the subscript AQ for aqueous, because this would be a dissolved in water solution or an aqueous solution. And this comes from the Latin for water. Now, we've already mentioned as well that it's not just ionic compounds that are going to dissolve readily in water. It's also going to be polar compounds. So something that's going to become a very common recurring theme in our course is going to be carbohydrates or sugars. And specifically, probably one of the most prevalent compounds that we'll discuss is glucose. So glucose is a monosaccharide. We'll talk about this in the following subtopic. And they are polar. So why are they polar? Well, if you take a look at a glucose molecule, it is composed of many OH groups, right? So OH, 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 OH. Anywhere where you have an OH, we already know what's going on here. The oxygen is pulling on electrons more than hydrogen. So anytime that you see an OH group, that's going to result in a slightly negative, slightly positive charge. The name of OH groups are actually hydroxyl groups. That just means any OH bonded to something. So anytime that you see a hydroxyl group on a molecule, you can already kind of predict that this thing is, at least that section of the molecule is polar. Because this O and H bond is not an equal bond. The electrons are spending more time around oxygen than they are around hydrogen. So that means that the more OH groups there are in a molecule, the more it's going to be able to dissolve. And glucose has plenty. In fact, carbohydrates in general have plenty of OH groups. So any molecule that is polar is going to be able to be also surrounded by water and dissolve within it, in the same kind of idea that we just talked about here. Now, there is a key difference that I want to exemplify here. Firstly, we have water and an OH group. Polar, hydrogen bonds are forming, right? But notice I did not show hydrogen bonds here. And that's because these aren't hydrogen bonds. Those of you that are taking IB chemistry, you'll be going into this interaction a little bit more. But this interaction is something called an ion dipole interaction. So this will not form hydrogen bonds. I just want to clarify that hydrogen bonds will only form between those polar interactions and with hydrogen. So this is an ion dipole interaction. And technically, again, those of you in chemistry will look at this. This would be a dipole-dipole interaction. Dipole-dipole, but don't worry about that. Bio, you can just say hydrogen bonds. That's perfectly fine. So the next part here is we've now discussed all the different properties of water. Now we're going to talk about, we're going to shift gears a little bit and be like, how is water useful in living organisms, therefore? So a big topic that we'll eventually do is metabolism. And metabolism really is just a bunch of interdependent web of reactions. Interdependent means this chemical reaction and this chemical reaction depend on each other. So it's a big web. Probably the most famous metabolic reaction that you guys are probably already aware of are things like cellular respiration or photosynthesis. These are all part of metabolism of a living organism. So what this learning outcome is trying to get across is that where metabolism takes place in living organisms is nearly always in water, in aqueous solutions. So the idea of water is a medium for metabolism, that's what they're talking about. Where you see water, that's where metabolism's happening. And so why is that? Why is water such a good medium for this to occur in the first place? Well, as a quick chemistry review, if I want a chemical reaction to occur, that's going to involve collisions. That means that one particle and another particle have to actually collide, and they have to collide with sufficient energy. Another concept that we'll explore when we actually look into enzymes. That will be its own whole subtopic. So when we talk about this kind of interaction, that means that if I can promote collisions, I can therefore promote enzymatic activity, I can promote catabolic, anabolic, metabolic activity. So the idea is that if this is taking place within water, you're going to get a lot of collisions. And specifically, enzymes are really key here. This is going to be like a very, very common recurring theme in this course, is just how important enzymes are for biology. And so enzymes, again, we'll have an entire subtopic on them, but they're proteins, generally speaking, that function as catalysts. And a catalyst is any substance that can, just for now I'll be a little brief, but it makes chemical reactions occur faster without being consumed in the chemical. So they are not reactants. Their true way that they function is they lower the activation energy, but that's something that we'll talk about when we do enzymes in C1.1. So when we say chemical reactions occur in water, well, where is this happening? Well, cells are mainly water. Cells are primarily composed of cytoplasm, cyto meaning cell, and plasm meaning like a jelly-like substance, and that's mainly water. So where you see a cell, you have cytoplasm, that's where most chemical reactions are happening, is within the cytoplasm itself. And it's really, really ideal. Why is this such an ideal environment for metabolism? Well, for one, a lot of enzymes actually need a certain degree of water around them in order to hold their shape in a proper orientation. Secondly, a lot of substrates will dissolve in the cytoplasm. And once you dissolve in the cytoplasm, it allows them to be readily moved and readily able to bind with enzymes. And it also means that hydrogen bonds are readily going to be able to form within a medium like such as water, allowing for substrates and enzymes to more readily be able to bind with each other. So the other thing that might seem odd to think about is, so far, I think I've tried to make it clear why being polar or why dissolving in water is so advantageous. But you can also get advantages for molecules that don't interact with water, or those molecules that are hydrophobic. So an example of where hydrophobicity is useful in organisms would be, for instance, another whole subtopic that we'll talk about is the structure of our membranes. And our membranes are composed of what's called a bilayer, meaning two-layer, 1,2, of a molecule called a phospholipid. And these molecules have both a polar section and a non-polar section. And because they have both of these sections, it allows them to form these structures within water. In fact, when we talk about the origin of life in HL, we'll discuss how these bilayers can actually spontaneously form in water, and why this was one of the crucial aspects of how we think the first cells even came to be. Another way, and why this is really, really important, is because it allows proteins to become embedded within these membranes. Some proteins will have hydrophobic sections and hydrophilic sections, allowing them to embed within structures. Another example of where hydrophobicity can actually be advantageous is in the example of certain kind of hormones. And a hormone is any molecule that basically sends a signal and travels through blood. So hormones that you've almost certainly heard of before are things like testosterone or estradiol or progesterone. All of these hormones, what they have in common is that they are all entirely hydrophobic. That means that they can actually pass directly through a membrane without needing any special transport. So it makes them very, very efficient signal carriers, if you will. And the other example that I have over here is that if you look at the very surface of leaves, this upper layer is called the epidermis. And that is coated with this waxy lipid layer. In fact, if you ever take a look at a leaf and you see the top part is kind of shiny, that is actually to prevent water from leaving in this direction. It's actually a method of conserving water and preventing a little bit of gas exchange from happening because the leaves want to only exchange on the bottom part of their leaves. So by having a hydrophobic side, they can more or less dictate or control where certain activities are taking place. Now, water is also an incredibly useful medium to transport materials. If I want to move something from one place to another place in a multicellular organism, like humans, I'm going to use water to do it. It's extremely useful to do so. So if I want to so let's use us as an example. Let's use mammals. So our delivery system throughout our whole body is the bloodstream. So the bloodstream is composed of vessels, things like arteries or veins or capillaries, and within those vessels is a liquid portion. That liquid portion is called plasma. That plasma, blood plasma, is mainly water. It's primarily composed of water. And that is not an accident. And that's because I can dissolve a bunch of things within blood plasma and I can transport it from one part of the body to the other part of the body. So, for instance, we transport a lot of ionic substances within blood plasma. Things like sodium chloride, things like potassium ions, calcium ions, any ions that I want to move around, they're easily going to be able to dissolve within the blood plasma. So that's advantageous. Secondly, as we just discussed before, I can easily transport polar substances. If I want anything that's polar, things like carbohydrates, things like urea, for instance, I can move these in the blood plasma as well. I can transport them from place to place. The building blocks of proteins, amino acids, actually have both a positive side and a negative side. They're sometimes referred to as Zwitter ions, which means that they have two different kind of charges. And because of this, they're able to actually readily dissolve within blood plasma. Oxygen, this one's slightly tricky. So oxygen does dissolve in water, but at our temperatures, our body temperature, for instance, which is 36, 37 degrees Celsius, it becomes saturated really, really quickly. So I actually can't dissolve that much oxygen within the blood. So instead, we have an adaptation to really boost how much oxygen we can carry, and that is red blood cells. So instead of dissolving oxygen directly within blood plasma, we instead bind it to proteins within red blood cells, a protein called hemoglobin. And that hemoglobin is actually what's going to carry oxygen gas throughout the body and deliver it to certain tissues. Finally, lipids, you would think, well, we're cooked. We can't transport lipids. They're entirely nonpolar. There's no way they're going to dissolve. And that's true. If you try to put some lipids directly into blood plasma, they are not going to dissolve in that blood plasma. That could become a problem because it means they can build up and we can get issues. So we do have a way of transporting lipids. And the way that we do that is with a structure called a lipoprotein. So it's a structure that's composed of phospholipids and proteins that effectively surround the lipid in a shell. And these guys can dissolve in water. So it's almost like I'm putting something that's insoluble coated by something that is soluble, and that thing can actually be carried from place to place. So that's how we carry non-polar things that otherwise would not dissolve within blood. We use these lipoprotein structures to do so. Now, it's not just animals with a bloodstream that transport things. Vascular plants, i.e. plants that have a xylem and a phloem, they also have to transport. Consider how large some trees are. Some trees are as tall as skyscrapers. How are they going to move substances like they photosynthesize in their leaves, potentially 10, 20 meters high, and they have to transport that to the roots? How are they doing that? They don't have a bloodstream. Instead of a bloodstream, they have two different vessels, xylem and phloem, which we'll discuss both of which in another subtopic, in the transport subtopic and the gas exchange subtopic. So xylem primarily transport ions that are dissolved within water, and phloem mainly carry sugars and other products of metabolism. In fact, if you tap into a tree and you see a sticky substance coming out, sap, you've hit this phloem. That's mainly what you've hit. That's what's primarily within phloem. So in this way, water is actually an incredibly good medium to transport things. It's an incredibly good medium for metabolism. And so we're already starting to see that water doesn't just have cool properties here and there. It's essential for the functioning of living organisms. This whole page is one big summary as to how do different animals take advantage of the physical properties of water. So I know right now this looks like a lot. I'll try to explain what's going on here. So the first thing is I want to go through different physical properties of water. So the first one is that of buoyancy, or what it means to float. What does this actually mean from a physical perspective? So buoyancy really just refers to any fluid, and again, a fluid from a physics perspective is a gas or a liquid. It doesn't have to be liquid. What is the force exerted by the mass, i.e. the weight of the object, versus the upwards forced? So if the object's density is less than the fluid's density, then it's going to float at the very, very top, right? Something like ice. If the object's density is equal to the fluid's density, then it will partially float near the top. But if the object density is greater than the fluid's density, then it's obviously going to sink. The purpose of this course is not for you guys to calculate any of this, okay? But to just understand what buoyancy means. Let's compare buoyancy, and let's see how does buoyancy differ between water and air. So water's density is hopefully, obviously, significantly higher than that of air. Now you might be like, yeah, obviously, one's a liquid and one's a gas. So right out of the gate, you probably know that. But the idea is that really density is just a matter of how much stuff per volume, right? That's all density is. So water has a far greater density than that of air. And that's just because, well, the particles are much more further apart. Why does this matter for living organisms? Well, the idea is that because living organisms are mainly composed of also water, most tend to float quite well in water because we are made up of very similar materials. So a lot of living organisms are actually quite buoyant inside of water. The other thing to keep in mind with water is something that we've discussed previously, and that is ice is less dense than liquid water. And this is huge. This means that it's going to be able to float on liquid water. Now air, if an animal wants to interact within air, it's going to, i.e. fly, it's going to need to be able to generate lift. And because it's going to be very, very difficult in order to get in there because we have much greater density than that of air. So we're going to use two different animals as examples here. We're going to use the black-throated loon and the ring seal as two key example animals here. Now, this is going to be a recurring pattern throughout this course. Anytime that you're going to use an animal as an example to answer your question, you can either use its common name or its species name. The common name is what I would just said, what it's known by in my country, in my language. So it would be the black-throated loon would be the common name. Now this common name may differ country to country, language to language. But the species name is universal and it is international. So the species name, something that we'll talk about when we do ecology and evolution, this first word is going to be capitalized. This is the genus, and this is the species. If you ever see this typed, it will be in italics. But if you ever are, if you're handwriting, I don't expect you to handwrite in italics, so we underline it. So that's the convention. If you're doing handwriting, you underline it, and that is the species name. So when you're ever using an animal as an example, you can either say this or this. It doesn't matter to me. Either one is fine. However, you would not be able to just say a loon. That's a little too broad. That's like saying the bear. There's many different species that we're talking about here, so you'd want to be specific. So let's talk about a black-throated loon, for instance. So the term here obviously comes from the fact that the throat or the plumage of the loon is black. And so how does the black-throated loon deal with buoyancy, both with respect to air and with respect to water? Well, in the air, it has extremely large wings relative to its body, and it can actually generate lift. They can fly. So because of their wings, they are able to actually generate enough lift that allows them to be, it's weird to think about flight this way, but it allows them to be buoyant in air, right? It allows them to stay inside of air because of the lift generated by their wings. Now, what about water? Well, you'd think, well, great, the black-throated loon can float. Isn't that awesome? Well, usually that's true for a lot of birds. Most birds, in order to accommodate them flying, their bones are actually hollow. So they have very, very low density. But this is actually not true for the black-throated loon. Unlike many other birds, their bones are actually not hollow. So their bones are actually solid. Now you might be like, isn't this counterintuitive? This is going to make them sink more. But they want to sink more because this is where they catch their prey. They go after fish. So they dive underwater to get fish. So in order to promote their ability to dive to catch fish, they actually have solid bones, and they're able to compress the air in their lungs and their feathers in order to increase their density and dive down much easier. Now, what about the thick boy here, the seal? So let's talk about the ringed seal. So the ringed seal, again, named after the fact that its skin have these lighter color rings around them. They're big. They're pretty heavy. I didn't put air here because ain't no way these guys are fine. Okay, that ain't gonna happen. But what about how do they interact with the water? Well, they're very, very heavy. So you might be like, well, there's no way that they're going to be able to do this. However, they actually can float fairly well because they have a really big reserve of something called blubber or fat. And that sits right below the skin. And that fat allows them to massively decrease their density because fat, something that we'll talk about in another subtopic, is that mass for mass, compared to muscle, let's say, to fat is far less dense. So it actually is massively able to increase their buoyancy within water. And also, they also use that floating ice as habitats. So they actually are able to take advantage of both of these things. Let's take a look at another property. This property is viscosity. And viscosity really is just the resistance to flow. So if something is very viscous, then it means that it has very high resistance and the thing does not flow readily. So as an example, something like honey. Pour it down and it's going to take a long time to fall because there's a lot of internal resistance. Whereas something that has very low viscosity is able to flow very, very easily. Let's first of all discuss how is viscosity different with respect to water and air. Yet again, the viscosity of water is take a look at the difference here. it's greater than it is for air. So there's more internal forces within water than there is air. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of water molecules very close to each other, and they are all forming intermolecular hydrogen bonds. So that's massively going to increase the amount of this. Now, it's weird for me to say that water is very viscous. Like, it's not compared to a lot of other things, but compared to air it is. So keep that in mind, right? Water as a liquid compared to other liquids is really low viscosity, but compared to, I mean, look at the values here. It's still very, very low, but it is still higher than that of air. And so the idea is that viscosity in air, of course, is extremely low because there's almost no internal forces between particles because they're so distantly far apart from each other. Why does this matter to animals? Well, for the black-throated loon here, the plumage or the feathers of the wings are actually adapted to hold and deflect air. And this is what's allowing them to generate lift. And they're also quite aerodynamic. And what I mean by aerodynamic is that if you're trying to cut through the air much easier, right? In fact, if you look at the side profile of aerodynamic vehicles versus non-aerodynamic vehicles, you tend to see that they almost taper this way versus a not aerodynamic vehicle will be like a box running through like this, right? So if you see birds are quite aerodynamic in the fact that they have their head here, they have their wing profile here, so the air is able to pass over this way. Now, they are also hydrodynamic, meaning they're able to flow through the water also quite easily. And this really helps from the fact that they have webbed feet, and these webbed feet increase propulsion. And actually, if you take a look at the position of these feet on a loon, they're actually placed quite far back, other way, in their body. So actually it makes them really awkward to walk on land because they're at the very back, but in the water it allows maximum propulsion within the water. What about the seal? Well, they also do have a streamlined shape in the fact that they are quite, they're actually probably a very great example of they are the most awkward looking animal on land, but in the water, they're like kind of terrifying because they're extremely fast and they can move through the water very, very quickly and very efficiently. So the idea is that their flippers are actually adapted also for propulsion and they have very little drag. So they're actually they are able to move through water very, very, very quickly. The third property that I want to look at is that of thermal conductivity. So thermal means heat. To conduct something is the ability of something to flow through. So conductance, or to be a conductor, means something flows through you very, very easy, right? So you can be a thermal conductor, you can be an electrical conductor, right? So if a property is thermal conductivity, it's how easily is energy as heat transferred through this object, right? So if you're a conductor, things move through you very, very easily. Something like a metal. A metal will be an extremely good thermal conductor where heat transfers through very, very fast. Anyone would know this if they've ever left a metal spoon inside of a soup or inside of a cooking pot and then touched the handle again. Usually, a lot of cookware actually may be made of metal or whatever, but the handles may be made of wood or plastic because those materials are actually thermal insulators, meaning that heat does not flow through them very, very easily. So why is this relevant to living organisms? Well, let's first compare yet again the difference of thermal conductivity between water and air. Yet again, water has a significantly higher thermal conductivity than air. And again, this is true because, once again, a lot of the particles of water are really close to each other. And the way that you have to transfer heat or energy in general is this particle hits this particle, which hits that particle. So the closer the particles are together, the faster of conductance you're going to get. And again, because air has particles so far apart from each other, it's a fairly good thermal insulator, not conductor. And I think we kind of already know this because if you've ever seen like the big puffy jackets that people wear, they're mainly air, right? The way that these jackets work is that you're creating a layer of air around you, and air is a very good thermal insulator where things do not flow through very easily. So how do the loon and the seal take advantage of this? Well, the black-throated loon is able to trap air within its feathers, and that actually acts as a thermal insulator. So in fact, we make a lot of jackets using down, which is baby bird feathers, or feathers in general, because they trap air really, really, really well. So for this reason, it allows them to really prevent heat loss and to keep a core temperature. Because you may not know, but birds, like mammals, are also warm-blooded, meaning that they maintain a constant internal body temperature. So this is something that the loon has to be able to do. In the water, because water is a much better thermal conductor than air is, that means if they're sitting on the water, they're going to lose body heat to water much faster than they would in air. So how do they prevent this? So they actually have an oil gland. So they literally secrete oil, they use their beak, and then they rub it on their feathers so that their feathers now have oil, which is hydrophobic. And in this way, it acts as an insulator. So they're almost adding a layer of insulation to try to mitigate any heat loss from their body to the water, because they spend a great deal of time on the water, especially because this is where they hunt. What about seals? Well, this is of great importance to seals because seals spend most of their time in the water or on the water, and they live in Arctic regions. And here, water temperatures are very, very cold. In fact, it may sound weird to think about, but ocean temperatures in the Arctic are lower than freezing. And that's because of salt water. So they have to deal with extremely cold air temperatures and very cold water temperatures. And they're mammals, which means they also have to maintain a core body temperature. How do they do that? Well, the same adaptation that we talked about earlier. They have very large stores of blubber. Some animals may have as high as 30 to 40% of their mass may be blubber. And because of this, it prevents a lot of heat loss. They're able to really keep a lot of their heat inside and prevent a lot of that dissipation. The last property I want to look at is that of specific heat capacity. This is an interesting physical property in that it's a little complicated to understand, but it's the amount of energy or heat required to raise the temperature of something else, right? So if you have a very high heat capacity, that means a lot of energy is needed to raise a temperature. So to look at it another way, if I have material A and material B, and both material A and B were both given the same amount of energy. Let's just say, I don't know, 1,000 joules. I'm just making it up. Now, I wait over time. I each provided them the same amount of energy. This increased by 2 degrees Celsius. This increased by 0.1 degrees Celsius. This tells you that it took way more energy here to raise temperature than it did over here. So B would have a far higher heat capacity than A would. So how does this matter, or what's the relevance here between air and water? And finally, yet again, water has a higher, much higher specific heat capacity compared to that of air. And the reason why water has such a high heat capacity is again due to all the hydrogen bonds that it forms with its neighbors. Because the only way to warm water up, the hydrogen bonds need to be broken, right? So if I want to heat something up, I have to break those hydrogen bonds as the things are moving. And every time hydrogen bonds are formed, they release energy. Therefore, water can absorb a lot of energy without changing. Now, this all sounds quite complicated, but I think it's all based on a fairly intuitive idea. And that's because, pretty sure you guys already knew this without realizing it. Consider how much air temperature changes in a given day. It could change, what, 10, 20 degrees sometimes in a given day? And how much in a given year does the ocean temperature change? How much does a lake temperature change? It's very steady year round. I think we kind of forget how high the heat capacity of water is because we use kettles and whatever to boil water. But consider how much energy that took to boil water. It takes an enormous amount of energy to boil water. So water actually has a very stable temperature typically because it takes a lot of energy to raise its temperature. Now, air is of course not the same. It's very easy to change the temperature of air. You can do it very, very quickly, and that's because the particles are much more spread out, meaning that I can much easier change the kinetic energy of those particles. So how is this relevant to seals and loons? Well, both seals and loons have blood. And with a bloodstream, I think this is a function of the bloodstream that a lot of people tend to forget. It's not just to transport materials around, it's actually also to circulate heat. By having your body constantly moving blood around, you're also easily circulating heat around. So by having an internal circulatory system mainly comprising of water, it allows both of their temperatures to be relatively stable. It allows us to keep circulating heat around our body much, much, much easier. And in fact, when we go into, in grade 12, there's a subtopic called homeostasis, and we'll talk about how we actually use this to keep our body temperature constant. Now, in terms of loons specifically, because throughout a given year, and loons tend to live in North America where it's very temperate, very cold winters, very hot summers, the water relatively, no matter what season we're looking at, is going to remain fairly constant, especially compared to that of the air. So they actually spend a lot of time on the water because it's a more stable temperature year round. Seals, again, are for the same reason. Adult seals are mainly in the oceans, so they have a fairly constant temperature year round. But this is not true for the young. So seal pups don't have the necessary blubber to maintain their temperatures just yet. So the adults build what are called these ice layers, where they will raise their young in these ice layers, almost like igloos, kind of. And because they're made of ice that has a lot of air, they're actually really good insulators. If you've ever considered why igloos are a good structure, they actually can be very warm because they're made of ice and snow, which has a lot of air packed inside. So they're actually very good insulators. It feels weird to say that ice will keep you warm, but a structure made of ice can actually act as a very good insulator because of all the air trapped within solid water. So the whole point of this learning outcome here is understanding how animals of your choice can use different physical properties of water. Why is water the medium of life? So why, as far as, and this is a concept that I will explore further when we do the HL component of this topic, but the idea is, as far as we know, we are under the impression, and at least all the evidence suggests that without water, we don't have life. So why is that? Why do we care so hard about water, and why is it so associated with life? This whole topic, hopefully I've already answered this question, but the idea is that, for one, we are the, quote, blue planet, in the sense that if you look at us from space, we're quite blue. It is a little misleading, though, in that the vast majority of this water is salt water. So this water is not freely accessible for, let's say, drinking. So the actual amount of fresh water on Earth is shockingly little, if you actually do the math in terms of how much there is. Where 97% approximately of all water on Earth is in oceans. And then you take that 3%, you're like, well, 3% left of freshwater is still a lot, but the majority of that is actually found in glaciers and in ice caps. And when those melt, they melt into the oceans. So that's lost as salt water as well. So that number is going to continue to drop. And a lot of it can also be found in groundwater. The water that we think about when we think of fresh water, things like lakes, rivers, streams, ponds, stuff like that, that's a much, much smaller fraction of what's left, maybe 1%. And if you look at even us, this number varies wildly depending on where you look, but a huge proportion of your body is made up of water. And your cells are maybe 70 to 80% water. So water is clearly highly, highly important. In fact, just about every single process we're going to talk about in this course is occurring in water, whether it's in the cells, whether it's in the blood, whether it's in this space between cells called interstitial tissue. All of that are aqueous solutions. So we're nearly always going to be talking about water. That's why I think if you were wondering why water got its own subtopic, it's because it's always there. It's always around, and we should be aware of it. The other thing to consider, and something that I'll go over more when I do HL, is life as we know it likely started in the oceans. We think the earliest life for a long time was in oceans, not terrestrially. A big reason for that is because the sun still emits very damaging UV radiation. The reason that we're not cooked is because we currently have an ozone layer, or O3. And ozone is able to absorb the very damaging type of that UV. But in early life, there wasn't oxygen yet, because photosynthesis hadn't evolved yet, and there was no oxygen gas, therefore there was no ozone. So anywhere on land was being literally cooked by high UV. So the safest part would have been in deep oceans because the UV ended up scattering and becoming dissipated. So the oceans kind of provided almost like a safe harbor for life really to evolve very early. Something that I'm also going to allude to in other topics is the fact that the things that make up our membranes, phospholipids, spontaneously can form in water. They actually don't need any proteins to build the structure. That they will build the structure spontaneously on its own. And this is just kind of a synopsis as to all the ways in which water is used or found in living organisms. It makes up the cytoplasm. It makes up the fluid in organelles. It is found in the interstitial fluid. It allows the transport of things, something that we talked about. It has a really high heat capacity, something else that we just discussed, allowing an easy transfer of heat around organisms. It also has, this is a property that we'll look at when we do homeostasis, but it also has a very high, what's called latent heat of vaporization. That is a fancy term for saying it takes a lot of energy to evaporate. We use this to cool ourselves with sweat. So sweating as a mechanism uses this property of water to pull heat away when we perspire, thus cooling us. And it's also something that we'll talk about when we study proteins. It's highly necessary for the proper folding of proteins in their given structure. And finally, in metabolism, it is directly involved in many chemical reactions. Two very important chemical reactions that will come up a lot in this course is that of hydrolysis and photosynthesis. And both of these processes require water as a reactant. So water is crucial for so many facets of life, both in metabolism, both in habitat, both as mediums for other processes. So at the end of the day, this is probably the too long didn't read version of this entire topic, and that is without water, life would not exist on Earth, at least as we know it. There's no shot. So this was me trying to convince you why water is really important. Let's review the learning outcomes for standard level of topic A1.1 Water. In standard level, there were 6 different learning outcomes. The first learning outcome really explored why is water the medium of life, i.e., why does life tend to occur in water? What processes of life all occur in water? Why is it so important, not just for current life, but why do we think water was necessary for life to have originated in the first place? This second learning outcome all had to do with hydrogen bonding as a consequence of the polar covalent nature of water. So this whole learning outcome is really understanding, why is water a polar molecule? Why do polar molecules form hydrogen bonds? This is also where you should be able to represent a single water molecule as such, but also multiple water molecules interacting with each other via hydrogen bonding. The third learning outcome here refers to water's interaction with other water molecules, i.e. cohesion. What kind of hydrogen bonds form between them? Why is this important? And what biological processes take advantage of this? The fourth learning outcome is that of adhesion, where water is actually able to attract other molecules other than water itself. And these molecules tend to either be charged or polar. And again, what are the consequences of this? What kind of biological processes take advantage of adhesion? The fifth learning outcome has to do with explaining why water as a medium is such a good solvent. What allows water to dissolve so many different molecules, and what things do not dissolve in water. Furthermore, what are the advantages of both the hydrophobicity and hydrophilicity of different molecules and their interaction with water? Finally, this learning outcome had to do with comparing and contrasting the physical properties of that of water and air, and specifically buoyancy, viscosity, thermal conductivity, and specific heat. And how are these physical properties of water being taken advantage of by certain animals that live in both water and in land, or in the air? And there's two examples that the course gives, that of the black-throated loon and the ring seal. Now, it is worth noting that these are not required examples to use, but they're suggested examples to use. So if you wanted to explore this learning outcome using a different animal of your choice, you could, so long as you provide either the common name or the species name, whichever you choose. If you are interested in learning further, which I always encourage, this final page is a good place to start. Here is where I outline which pages in the specific textbooks I used in order to create some of these lessons, if you wanted to take a look at them further. Underneath are simulators and interactives that I think will really help explore a lot of the concepts that we looked at, such as polarity, hydrogen bonding, specific heat, and surface tension. All of these are really good places to start if really trying to almost a hands-on experience, so to speak. Underneath are really nice 3D models of water, both in its solid form and in its liquid form, and how it forms hydrogen bonds with itself. These articles are ones that I would encourage for further reading if you really want to learn more about why water is so necessary for life, but also the water's role in looking for life outside of the planet, something that we've explored further in higher level. Finally, I would always encourage you not just to learn for the sake of a test, but to learn for the sake of learning. Find enjoyment out of learning.